We invoke God, the supremely benevolent and endlessly merciful. Peace be upon you all. Once more, we have returned with our recurring question and answer series alongside Javed Ahmed Ghamidi. Our deepest thanks to you, Ghamidi Sahab, for giving us your time. Previously, we had gained some valuable insights from you about the land of Palestine, including about its religious, historical, and political significance, its current standing, as well as the historical developments across various periods. We then transitioned to discussing the contemporary global position of Muslims in the current political landscape and the transformations occurring on the global front. What is the current position of Muslims regarding this matter, and what capabilities do they currently possess in this context as matters stand on the world stage? Could you kindly link our previous conversation to this topic and elaborate for our viewers? You have also mentioned the dynamics of the rise and decline of nations. You addressed the factors that contribute to their advancement and those which leading to their deterioration. We had arrived at the conclusion that the age of conquest has ceased to exist. By this time, global powers had been forming empires through conquests. But now this period had come to an end. It heralded the start of a new era. In this new epoch, did Muslims find themselves? Where were they positioned? Furthermore, what shifts occurred regarding the Palestine issue? Please say more about these topics.
This extensive dialogue that has preceded had aimed to provide clarity on the context of various issues, such as Palestine, the Kurds, and Kashmir, which are often misconceived as merely regional conflicts, but in fact have emerged against an international backdrop. It was essential to clarify this, that after the Prophet had conclusively established his argument on his people, peace be upon him, his companions undertook some measure according to the divine command. The outcome of these actions was the conquest of this land, that is Arabia, as well as some others. I had shared these details with you. Thus, post the era of the companions, these actions became a legacy for Muslims. In other words, they acted on divine instructions, with their legitimacy also being derived from the divine book, initially set forth by the Prophet, and then they were carried to completion by his followers. This territory was conquered alongside numerous other areas. This whole process essentially transformed the Western Byzantine Empire as well as the Eastern Sassanid empires, along with their territories, and assimilated them into the Islamic Empire, or you may say, the Empire of Muslims. I then highlighted that during this period, it was not that Western empires had just remained passive. They attempted to reclaim their losses, especially Palestine. Their justification was its sanctity for them as well. This was because it was a holy place for Christians as well. Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, had traveled there from his birthplace Nazareth. After descending from the Mount of Olives, he initiated his prophetic mission in Jerusalem. It was in this city he was tried to be crucified, and it was from here that he departed from this world. His mother, Mary, peace be upon her, who is revered as the Mother of God by them, is also buried there. The place holds numerous sacred sites related to their history. Their attempts to recapture it culminated in success in 1099 CE. This led to nearly a century of Christian rule in Jerusalem. In 1187, Sultan Salahuddin successfully reclaimed it. The purpose of recounting this entire narrative was to illustrate that during those times, Muslims were on an equal footing, and for a significant duration, they even held a superior position. They managed to reclaim it despite emerging weaknesses in various spheres of Muslim life. That is, political cohesion had weakened, the Abbasid Caliphate's influence had waned compared to the eras of Harun and Mamun. Despite these challenges, their efforts were fruitful. In numerous parts of the vast Muslim empire, monarchical rule started being established, meaning some regions which were erstwhile parts of the empire had become autonomous, though a form of political unity was still symbolically or religiously acknowledged under the caliphate. This explains why, later, the Ottomans assumed the mantle of caliphate themselves. Sharing all this was also intended to highlight that power had in a manner been restored. Additionally, It aimed to clarify that during those times, the sources of power, knowledge, means, and resources weren't as divergent as they later became. Starting from the mid-16th century, the Western world began experiencing a reawakening. From this point on, signs of decline were becoming apparent. I mentioned that fundamentally 3 factors could be observed. 1, there was a gradual decline in knowledge and morality among Muslims. 2, there was a loss of religious focus that once distinguished them. And 3, there was a disintegration of their political unity, though the Ottomans provided some support to an extent. Since the mid-16th century, Western nations embarked on a renaissance. I detailed before you some facts about the Reformation, which was a movement for religious reforms, given the prevailing dominance of religion and the established institution of the papacy, which was quite strong. This era was, in a sense, an age of faith for them as well, where religion was the source of all intuitive knowledge, where religious figures were highly revered and their teachings were universally followed. It was a time when the church ruled akin to monarchs. This unique situation began evolving. Initially, as expected, religion and its clerical leaders faced challenges. The challenge wasn't against religion as an ideology, but against its manifestation in religious authority. Until then, the church had more or less the same kind of authority as the monarchs used to hold, but gradually there was a movement toward reformation. The first thing that happened was that the church and the people representing it, the clergy, started being challenged. Religion wasn't challenged qua religion, but in the manner it used to manifest in the power of the church. I had mentioned that Germany was the primary center of Reformation movement. Following this, the Renaissance emerged. The Renaissance signified the revival of sciences, the search for the foundations of knowledge. The West tried to re-establish connections with Greece. The translations made by Muslims were read with great interest and translated to Latin, and universities began to operate in a manner less controlled by the church. This marked the start of the Renaissance. This led to what we call the scientific revolution, which transformed the world by altering the foundations of knowledge and radically changing scholarly temperament. A surge in inventions followed. The strength equation between West and the Islamic world began shifting dramatically. Consider the difference in military capabilities between then and now. The disparity is stark. Subsequently, I briefly mentioned another shift among Western nations, like England's ventures in industry and exploration despite being a small island. These nations embarked on explorations, with the Portuguese and Spanish discovering new worlds, like America and its surrounding regions. Later, colonization efforts expanded, creating possibilities for new worlds. These lands were rich in resources and helped foster a spirit of enterprise. Observing this, other Western nations, including the Dutch, French, and British, ventured out, seizing the opportunity. This led to conflicts, which is beyond the scope of our current discussion to detail further. The 1776 independence of America can also be perceived as the conclusion of an epoch for us. Hence, power acquisition, territorial dominion, and the identification of trade prospects emerged as the determinants of power. Concurrently, there was the emergence of novel scientific disciplines. Therefore, I noted that by the 15th century, their dominion and influence had been established along coastal territories. We recall the period when individuals like Vasco da Gama reached India's shores. Their naval influence had extended to the Far East and the intervening islands, as well as southern Africa, where their presence and influence had already existed. Subsequently, the decision was made to explore colonial prospects here. Thus, the British made their way to India. It is known that the Mughal Empire had been ruling here, which had been gradually weakening, and by 1857, control of the Indian subcontinent effectively passed to the British. Practically speaking, their dominion was apparent in several areas beforehand, and the Mughal emperor's authority was confined to the vicinity outside Delhi to Palam only. Elsewhere in India, British dominance had been firmly established. Hence, in India, a vast empire existed, which is not minor by any means. British India, in those times, encompassed much of the region from Burma and Assam to Afghanistan. This expansive area fell under British rule. In the Far East, their influence was already notable, where it was exerted directly in some locales and indirectly in others. As for those areas within the Ottoman Empire's sphere, here the British lacked presence, and that empire symbolized the center of Muslim power. However, signs of fragility were emerging there as well. Amid this scenario, the Renaissance unfolded. Novel methods in industry and scholarship were being devised. It wasn't just that this innovation in knowledge significantly impacted military and material resources. New philosophical perspectives on religion and knowledge arose. No longer were sacred texts, prophets, and religious figures the primary sources of intuitive understanding. Humanity assumed the central role. Previously, the whole intellectual orientation of man was God-centric. It was now shifting to becoming human-centric. Religions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism were gradually being supplanted by humanism. Fresh political and social theories emerged alongside debates about human nature, its societal impacts, and the significance of human intellect. Thus, human reasoning gradually became the pivotal decision-making authority. While thought patterns were transforming on one front, power centers were shifting on another. Thus, emerging powers which had their vast resource pools began to assert themselves globally. I mentioned that the Ottoman Empire, albeit somewhat persistently, was nearing the end of its strength. Yet Western nations did sense an internal challenge. This wasn't prompted by any external opposition from India, the Far East, or the Ottoman Sultanate. Rather, the initiative came from Germany, initially sparked by Austria and Hungary. This internal challenge led to the onset of the Great War. The buildup of the First World War was characterized by a complex web of alliances. There were the Allied powers on one side, which included Britain, France, Russia, Italy, and Japan, with America joining in the final year. And opposing them were the Central Powers, namely Germany, Austria, and Hungary. And then, at one point, Turkey or the Ottoman Empire also joined them. This alignment marked the advent of the New World. We should pause to reflect on these issues. So when did this New World emerge? It resulted from these developments. You would know that Muhammad Ali Jauhar penned a series of articles titled The Choice of the Turks, which was a reflection on the decisions that the Ottomans had to make. They could have sided with the Allies or remained neutral. Initially, they seemed neutral, but deeper historical analysis reveals internal dynamics. Consider Great Britain, whose empire was so vast that the sun never set upon it, ruling even over India. Now it faced the Ottoman Empire, along with its allies. This confrontation brought previously obscured issues to light. It revealed the considerable strength and position these powers had attained, and now the Ottomans had to face this challenge. And Great Britain, a global superpower, played a leading role in this confrontation, especially in regions which are part of the Islamic world. From the perspective of Europe, one might debate the roles of France, Russia, and later America's significant contribution, but our focus should remain on this dynamic, namely Britain and its role in the Muslim lands. Interestingly, in this war, the Ottoman Empire, which was aligned with the Axis powers, with Austria-Hungary, was involved in a conflict with England, France, and later America, whereas on the other side, Indian soldiers enlisted in the British Army by the hundreds of thousands. This was the scenario then, and then the war finally culminated in their defeat. It began in 1914 and concluded in 1918. I mentioned that the Balfour Declaration was issued around November 1917. Why did the Balfour Declaration take place? When war takes place, then it is not just battlefield engagements that constitutes war. There are significant background activities which also occur. To secure their victory, the British entered various agreements with the Arabs. We now know through historical documents that they had promised the establishment of an independent Arabian Sultanate post-Ottoman rule. Similarly, efforts were made to support any powers under Ottoman control that could be swayed against them. This was facilitated covertly by the Allies through various agreements, some documented, others verbal, there with certain assurances made in the background. As their war progressed towards victory, the Jews also played a part. Within the British Empire, which waged the war, Jews held parliamentary positions and engaged in negotiations. At this juncture, a declaration was made for the Jews, in which promises were made paralleling similar promises to the Arabs. The declaration was that upon victory, a national home for Jews would be established in Palestine. This term, national home, was unusual. It suggested something less than a state. When viewed through the lens of contemporary nation-states, even then it appears to be quite a peculiar concept. Nevertheless, in November 1917, the Balfour Declaration was announced. It wasn't about deception or fraud, which is common in wartime backgrounds. Treachery and deceit continuously occurred. Agreements are made, each party deceiving the other as they feel necessary. Such actions are typical in war, and they proceeded accordingly. Part of war is deception, so these kinds of things do happen, and they also engaged in them. Upon achieving victory, they began fulfilling their promises. The League of Nations was established by the victors. They had recognized the threat of internal challenges. It was a response to the domestic turmoil triggered by Austria, Hungary, and Germany, which led to a catastrophic war. This conflict resulted in the loss of tens of millions of lives, leaving countless widows and devastating the European economy. Consequently, they were compelled to cease their activities across various nations. So now, how something like this could be prevented in the future to ensure the newly formed states remained under their influence and something like the Great War wasn't repeated, the League of Nations was founded. Subsequently, all agreements and treaties they had brokered were handed over to this body. Thus, they aimed, as the era of creating sultanates and extending dominions was concluding, such as in India or in certain African nations where France dominated Algeria, or their attempts to establish control in the Americas. It was no longer feasible to continue colonization on the old method. Hence, a global framework was proposed to sustain their dominance, which was meant to adapt to the changing landscape and new ideologies. Now, what were these new ideologies? The world was gradually embracing the principle of non-aggression towards territories. It led to the 1928 International Consensus that no territorial conquest could be deemed lawful. Naturally, territories needed to be defined. How would these territories be delineated? The concept of national states was to emerge, where countries were defined by their respective nationalities. What would constitute these national identities? Would race or territory be the basis? Racial segregation was impractical, as diverse races had settled globally. Consider India. Were only Hindus, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, or Brahmins inhabiting it? The world had undergone profound changes. Thus, the notion of nation-states, based on geographical boundaries, started to form. Acknowledging this led to another inevitable outcome: the recognition of each nation's right to self-determination. If they desired self-governance, it was their prerogative. Hence, principles and conceptions such as fundamental rights, the right to self-determination, rule of law, and democracy began to gain global acceptance. This intellectual evolution was not isolated to the invention of new technologies like warplanes or computers, but involved significant contributions from various thinkers. Just as religious ideas are debated within our communities, so too were these concepts scrutinized and developed in the West over centuries. All this contributed to the formation of this new world order.
Social sciences also advanced.
Alongside the social sciences flourished. This led to the embrace and spread of new ideologies globally. Now imagine someone speaking out against democracy, the rule of law, or the right of nations to self-determination. An immediate widespread backlash would ensue.
Or against human rights.
Similarly, opposing fundamental human rights, which later became integral to the UN Charter, and now every constitution upholds them. The judicial system is grounded in these principles. It would reject any constitutional laws that contravene human rights. These concepts were evolving. Thus, the development of these ideas, alongside covert dealings and the status achieved through victory, opened the door to establishing a new global system. Efforts were made to create this system, during which the League of Nations assigned Britain the mandate. This meant that now on Britain's intention was not to annex Palestine or Arab territories into its empire, but it wanted to grant them the freedom referred to as independence. So the implication of this mandate was that this nation should now get ready to run its own affairs autonomously. Britain was tasked at the international level with this duty to prepare Palestine, so to speak, for self-governance. This international system wasn't flawless. Rather, it was crafted by the victorious powers. Under this system, since the 1917 declaration to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine, Britain actively worked to create favorable conditions for Jewish immigration. Initially, their numbers were few, only in the thousands. Perhaps at maximum, there were about 100,000 of them, but efforts continued to increase their population for a feasible national home. The challenge faced initially was encountered again with the onset of the Second World War, and there again, Germany played a central role again, and the alliances started shifting. Now it included Japan as well, and Italy under Mussolini also aligned with Germany, which had switched sides from the First World War. This war also resulted in victory for the Allies, just like the previous war, and this led to the dissolution of the League of Nations and the establishment of the United Nations. Now, the summation of all this is that this new international system wasn't created by a consensus of all nations or on universally agreed principles. None of these things happened, but rather it was the construct of the victors of both of these wars. Thus, traditional forms of conquest and territorial control would be discontinued. They wouldn't continue with them, but instead would replace it with a different kind of dominance. This new world order positioned Muslims, among others, as the defeated, living under the system established by the victors. Here, I had made that statement, at which some people expressed amazement, that we used to be victors, but now we became the vanquished. So we, as the vanquished, are living under a system built by the victors. This reality contrasts with the notion of sovereign independence as claimed by many nations. This is nothing. None of this holds true. An international framework is being crafted, grounded in principles derived from social and cultural studies, which the victorious powers have adopted. I'm not suggesting these principles are flawed. They are open to critique, acceptance, and disagreement. Yet, they aren't the product of thorough deliberation, crafted by just and insightful thinkers, leading to the United Nations creation.
Thus, the veto power was reserved.
Indeed, the victors of the past designed this system. This structure, when it was established, was the endeavor of dominant powers granted exclusive privileges. With its transition into the United Nations, similar dynamics persist. Are there powers outside this system capable of challenging the victors? Have Muslims or any other nation developed such capability? The 5 permanent members essentially govern the world. and based on resources, knowledge, and collective ethical standards, the benchmarks for nation supremacy. It is these five powers which are controlling the global order. In this regard, now to debate who was deceitful or who betrayed who is futile. Were the opinions of the Palestinian people considered, or were they treated as mere objects? This is the victor's way. Before this, previous conquerors didn't even inquire.
They enslaved people?
In the past, enslavement was common. Territories were seized. With the advancement of arts, sciences, and new ideologies in the West, concepts like the right to self-determination, rule of law, and justice through international bodies were introduced. Yet, these were not as if divinely ordained, embodying universal justice. They were the victor's resolutions, and here the preservation of their status is paramount, while creating a system for the defeated, and the Muslims experienced the greatest impact. Germany, Italy, and Japan came civilizationally closer to the West, whereas the Muslims, having been unified under the Ottoman Empire, went on to face the most significant upheaval. Now at this point, we must ask ourselves this question: are we fighting only Israel or only India? In this scenario that persists, whether it be conflicts with Israel, India, or between Turkey and Iraq, it involves nations arbitrarily created by these victors. The entire Middle East was partitioned this way. The creation of Pakistan and many other nations are outcomes of these wars, allowing certain powers to ascend or maintain supremacy, thereby dictating the fate of nations. It is these two wars and the nations that won, that reached the pinnacle of power, having won the war, which collectively decided the fate of the nations and created a new order, having foregrounded their supremacy and interests. They are the ones who have actually decided the fate of nations. The real debate isn't about the fairness of these decisions or whether bringing Jews was just or unjust, nor is it about the injustice of establishing a nation for one people in the land of the Palestinians. These discussions are secondary. The crux is that we are under a system devised by the victors. Until the vanquished change the conditions based on which they have tasted defeat, no amount of resistance will be able to change it. Be it through intifada, regional alliances, or creating organizations like the OIC, it will not alter the status quo. There is no possibility. In such circumstances, I had advised that instead of rejecting the 1947 decision enacted in 1948, when Israel was established and joined the UN in May 1949, instead of rejection, we should have accepted it. We should have strategized at an international level. Our leadership should have had this foresight to transform this defeat into victory. And the way to do that is what I had laid down in those 3 points. That should have been the focus of our energies. We should have focused on education, and our intellectuals should have spent their critical energies toward it. What have we done? We resort to throwing stones, thereby risking losing even what we have, as seen in Kashmir, Kurdistan, and Palestine. I critique this approach as ineffective. Neither international law nor these actions will lead to change. These were decisions made at an international level. To overturn them requires the same dedication to education and progress that took nations 300 years to achieve.
Through these many episodes, you have detailed the Palestine issue, its religious, political, and historical context, our current stance, and its historical placement. You've navigated us through political and international realms, and you have urged Muslims to view these matters with honesty and realism, highlighting viable solutions. Your analysis has grounded us in reality, though many secondary questions remain, which I hope to explore in our next session. Our time concludes here. Thank you immensely for your insights.